titled this sermon, as you probably have already read in your bulletin, Power Packing Parable, right? PPP. A Power Packing Parable. Now I'm referring, of course, to the parable that we just heard of Jesus telling the parable of the king who separates the sheep from the goats. Those poor goats. Anybody who knows a goat knows it's the cutest, nice little animal that eats just anything that you put near its mouth and follows you loyally all day long. But not so in this parable. And so the king is going to separate the sheep from the goats. But honestly, every one of Jesus' parables, whether it be the longer ones like this one or the shorter ones, every one of them is power packing. I think the real problem, or the real issue for us is that we've heard these parables over and over and over again. And with each hearing, they mean less and less and less. I mean, of course God's going to separate the sheep from the goats. And of course the goats are going to go away to eternal punishment. And of course we're not the goats, right? That's the moral of the story. You guys are all cool. It's everybody else that has to... Wait, that's not the point of the story, is it? But that's what happens. We tend to take ourselves outside of the message as if we're just objectively listening to it, and Jesus is really talking to somebody else besides us. Now, Jesus was not the first to realize that things were skewed in the world. It wasn't like a sudden revelation that just dawned upon Jesus one day and everybody's like, wait, you're right. Things aren't right in the world. This is something that people have known from the very beginning, that some have and some have not. That some live abundantly and others just scrape to get by, if they get by at all. And Jesus comes from a long line of prophets and people who saw that the very people who were put in place to protect the people end up becoming the ones who rape and rob and oppress the people. And I mean that both literally and metaphorically. Now the book of Ezekiel, which is the first book we read from today, the book of Ezekiel was written during the Babylonian exile. And I know that most of you know what the Babylonian exile is by now. That's where the Jews were taken over by Babylon, and their main leaders, their scribes, their priests, their kings, their princes were all taken out of their land and put into Babylon to live in shame, reminding them that they are no longer in power and that there is no more Israel they can call home. The author is looking at suffering, is looking at the suffering that Israel was going through as a result of the exile, and he believes that God was that God allowed this to happen because it was the result of the fat sheep, and the fat and strong sheep at that, right? In other words, the leaders were not doing what they were supposed to be doing, and as a result of that, they made some poor choices, and as a result of those poor choices, this befell them. Now God, if we look at, if we look at it, some of the fat sheep, some of the sheep had gotten fat and strong and had abandoned God, while neglecting the very flock they were put in place to protect. And by getting fat, by taking away from the other sheep, it made those sheep lean. So we get the parable, right? We get what Ezekiel's talking about here with the fat and strong sheep and the lean and weak sheep. It's not a mystery what's being said here. And in Ezekiel, God cries out, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. To paraphrase, God says that the fat sheep will get theirs in the end. Oh, you may be fat now, but you just wait. God will give you yours in the end. And he will set a shepherd over his neglected sheep to feed and to care for them. Now, Jesus clearly sees himself as the shepherd. And what's important to say here is, in Ezekiel, he talks about it being David, but David had died long before the exile. So clearly this shepherd was to come, who was going to be like David, who was going to rule justly, who was going to be one who was after God's own heart. Jesus sees himself as that shepherd. And the similarities between his parable and God's words in Ezekiel are mind-blowing. I bet when you had heard this parable before, you hadn't thought Ezekiel. But clearly, Jesus is drawing from Ezekiel in this parable. God talks about separating the fat sheep from the lean sheep. Jesus talks about a king who separates the sheep from the goats. Or, let's face it, kind of like lean sheep, right? God talks about feeding and caring for the lean sheep. Jesus says that the righteous shall feed and care for the least of these, who are the lean sheep. God talks about destroying the fat and the strong and feeding them justice. Jesus says that the goats go to eternal punishment. Sounds like justice to me. The one difference between the two is that in Ezekiel, it is God who is going to directly care for the sheep through a just ruler who God puts in place. Now, in Ezekiel's day, they weren't looking forward to Jesus himself, but to some ruler who would establish the throne in Jerusalem and kick out the oppressors and lead as the king was supposed to lead. But Jesus' parable flips this image on its head. No longer for Jesus is he looking for some king to come and lead and do what the very people themselves should have done from the very beginning. In it, God is seen not only feeling bad for the oppressed, but God is actually in solidarity with the oppressed. In it, God is no longer some distant being from some faraway place in a land long, long ago in a time far, far away, right? And I said that in reverse, but you get the point, right? No longer is God this distant being looking down going, oh, my lean sheep, I'm sorry. I'll bring you justice someday. In it, God is one of the oppressed. In fact, those who oppress and neglect others are, in fact, oppressing and neglecting God. Those who care for the oppressed and neglected, the least of these, are, in fact, doing so for God. The people aren't to wait for a ruler to come and do the job for them, which was the problem with the king system to begin with. If we go back to Samuel, when Samuel's objecting to them having a king, that was the problem with it to begin with. You're relying on someone else to do the work you should be doing. The people aren't to wait for a ruler or a superhero or somebody to fly in and save the day. They are to do it themselves. And to reject this, Jesus says, is to reject God. Now that is a power-packing parable. Because that parable is speaking directly to us. It's so easy for us to turn on the television and bemoan all of the awful things going on in the world as if we're not playing a very part in it. Jesus says no more. Acknowledge the part you play. Turn from the part you are playing. And be all that God has created you to be. No longer wait for somebody else to come in and do the job for you. Stand up and do the job God has called you to do. Indeed, a power-packing parable. In it, Christ is calling you, yes, you, to action. As a follower of Christ, you are called to care for the least of these. And those tend to be the people that we don't like, right? The least of these. Who are the least of these in your life? Who are the people you are neglecting to serve? We often just go right ahead to the poor, the people who go to the food pantries. It's easy to pass out a can of beans and some SpaghettiOs as if that's nutritious to these people, right? And say, we are taking care of the least of these. But Jesus would have you reflect and say, no. Who are the least of these in your life? Who are the people you would rather not be around? Who are the people you would rather remain lean and thin while you stay strong and fat? Who are the least of these in your life? You, my friends, are called to care for them, whoever they are. God is separating those who do from those who do not. The time for action is now. Right now. Inaction is saying no to Jesus. We often say, well, okay, I'll think about it. I'll pray on it. I'll just go home and I'll pray on that. But if we don't react to the gospel message, we are saying no to the gospel message. The time to act is now. Remember, God stands in solidarity with the least of these. And the question for us today is, will you stand in solidarity with the least of these? So 2 questions for you to ask yourself today. Who are the least of these in my life? And are you willing to stand with them in solidarity as one of them? But also, are you willing to empower them to rise up and do the same for the least of these in their life? I hope you will say yes.